So I want to talk shortly about ethics and the brain before I take some questions. But I want to talk about my approach, which is about deontology primarily, and about the relationships between individuals. My argument, in short, is that deontological relationships between any two individuals, any two beings, that includes things that don't have higher order processing, have to take into account the capacity of each individual to be aware of their relationship to each other. So it has to be capable of taking into account the higher order processes that are going on in the brain and the mind, and the impact that the higher order processes have on the performance of future actions, basically future behaviors, and particularly the role that mental states play in neurological functions, but also in physical functions, in the way that we understand agency physiologically as well as psychologically and mentally. So my argument is that there is a mutual deontological standing between any two individuals who are agents. So there is some...
It is possible to report.
There we go.
There.
So A has the deontic standing to B such that the standing represents an obligation. If B is also an agent, then B has some deontic standing to A such that A is an obligation. This is true if and only if both B and A are agents. So both have to be, just like this, agent. If they're not, then something else has to happen, and this is where we get into the really muddy area that I actually want to deal with, which has to do with primate cognition and childhood cognition, and whether or not they actually disqualify people from being agents. So, does a 5-year-old have an ethical obligation, or does a 5-year-old not have an ethical obligation? If they do, what are the extent of those? Why? That sort of thing. I think the only way to talk about that is in terms of what are the cognitive capacities of the person who's supposed to have the obligation. I think once you step outside of that, you kind of see sort of mistake. So that's a discussion of what I refer to as the muddied and controversial boundaries of agency with respect to individuals like these who have higher order mental states. I will come back to children and primates, though I'll kind of ad-lib that part because I haven't written those sections yet. It's important to establish first what I mean by agency because it gets used in a lot of different ways. Those ways are not consistent. Beth Huffer wrote a great paper, but one of the, I divvy it up 2 ways. I say there are 2 ways that you can use the word agency. A, it refers to an individual agent who embarks on a particular course of action, or, the process by which a particular agent embarks on a particular course of action. So agency represents the actual mental states by which something does an action, where the mental states have the impact of behaviors, or it can be the moral status attributed to some being which allows for deference to that process before and instills the culpability in that individual, in that being. So I divvy these 2 up. For me, agency is the process. Agency is the series of mental states that lead to the production of behavior. Oh, and based on my own sort of set of arguments, also neurological states matter. So neurological states underlie the behaviors primarily.
Hello.
And the second refers to what I call agent status, which is social recognition of the agency of any individuals. I'll get into that distinction later. When I talk about agency, I mean something like social intelligence. Social intelligence, in this case, I'm using the word intelligence to reference the way in which a set of cognitive functions represent and attribute value to a set of decisions. So first, they have to represent the set of decisions. Secondly, they have to value the set of decisions in order to make one. Represent a set of possible states of affairs. I have option A, I have option B, I have option C. Then you have to have a value system for how to pick one of those states of affairs. There are 3 primary functions that are primarily identified in socialization and social intelligence. taking a quote from Patricia Churchland's book, Brain Trust, she identifies three. I'm only going to talk about two, but she says there are three. The first, urges to care about the welfare of self, offspring, mates, and affiliates. Two, the capacity to evaluate and predict what oneself and others will feel and do in particular circumstances. And three, a neural reward and punishment system linked to internalizing social practices and applying them suitably. So for me, 1 and 2 are what matter. The urges to care about the welfare of self, offspring, mates, and affiliates, and then also the capacity to evaluate and predict what the individual is going to do, what the consequences of any given action are going to be. I argue at length that there are certain regions of the brain that are necessary to the presence of certain cognitive functions. So these are cognitive functions. 1 and 2 are cognitive functions. Urge to care is a cognitive function. Capacity to evaluate and predict is a cognitive function. That there are certain cognitive functions necessary for the existence of agency. Churchland helps me out with that. But then I argue, additionally, Churchland also has something to say about this, that there are certain regions of the brain that are necessary for the existence of these cognitive functions. Syllogistically, if neurological, now it's not neural, this one's not neural either. Can I switch pens? Yeah, neurological system U is sufficient for some mental state N. Mental state N is responsible for agency. Then hypothetical syllogism, we get to say N is responsible for agency. It's just sort of straightforward syllogism. There are going to be objections to probably this one, to the first step. Though those objections are kind of tricky. There may also be objections to whether or not it's appropriate to qualify agency in terms of mental states, though I haven't really run across any of those just yet.